Welcome, everyone. My name is Asad Ahmed. I'm professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies and the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Berkeley. Welcome to this program that is put forward by a collaboration between the center and Bayan. I do not want to take too much of your time because we have an eminent figure in our presence, and I think we should hear more from him. Dr. Nasr, Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr does not require any introduction, and I say this often. One says this as a matter of convention, but in this case, one certainly means it. But since there is a sunnah in these events to say something about the guest, I think I will follow it. But I will be brief. I will not introduce too many of the aspects of his accomplishments. There are too many to list. Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr is an Iranian university professor of Islamic studies at George Washington University and an Islamic philosopher. He speaks and writes on subjects such as philosophy, religion, spirituality, music, art, architecture, science, literature, civilizational dialogues, and the natural environment. He has also written 2 books of poetry. Dr. Nasr is the author of over 50 books and 500 articles, a number of which can be found in the journal Studies in Comparative Religion, on topics such as traditionalist metaphysics, Islamic science, religion and the environment, Sufism, and Islamic philosophy. He has written works in Persian, English, French, Arabic, and other languages, and these include an introduction to Islamic cosmological doctrines, conceptions of nature, and methods used for its study by the Ikhwan al-Safa. It was one of, in fact, the first work of Dr. Nasr that I had the pleasure of reading when I was a student, and it was enlightening. The other works include 3 Muslim sages, Avicenna, Sohrawardi, Ibn Arabi, Science and Realities of Islam, Science and Civilization in Islam, and so on. He has also received many, many, many prestigious awards and recognitions, including in 2000, a volume that was devoted to him in the prestigious Library of Living Philosophers. This was another way that I discovered Dr. Nasr when I was sitting in the 5th floor of the Sterling Library as an undergraduate and scanning through the books in the philosophy section. There it was, that volume next to Quine, I think. So I was, and he's the only Muslim philosopher, as far as I know, to receive this honor. He was also the recipient of the Templeton Religion and Science Award, the first Muslim and first non-Western scholar to deliver the prestigious Gifford Lectures, and has an honorary doctorate from the Faculty of Theology of Uppsala University in Sweden. Several Festschriften have been prepared in his honor. In fact, most leading scholars, in fact, perhaps all of them, receive only one. Dr. Nasr has received several of these collections in his honor, and a number of volumes have appeared collecting his writings. I should end by saying that the latest, I'm proud to say, was the definitive collection prepared by my own doctoral student and now colleague, Dr. Muhammad Umar Farooq, and it is called The Pen and the Tablet. So with this, I should pass the moment on to Dr. Nasr. We're very much looking forward to your lecture. Thank you for joining us.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to speak to friends at Berkeley. I've been to Berkeley many times in the old days and lectured there. I've known many scholars over the years, and I'm very glad to be able to spend a few minutes with you now through these really impersonal means that have been invented. I would have preferred to be there in person to meet you, friends and colleagues, and also the students, the audience in person, but that is not possible. So we thank God that at least this possibility of speaking from far away exists. When I was approached to give a lecture to your group, I suggested to speak about Sufism. And the title that was chosen, Religion in the Contemporary World, Observations on the Islamic Tradition and Spirituality, was not chosen by me. For some reason, that was what you people decided to choose that, but that's all right. But nevertheless, I'm going to concentrate because I'm going to speak for only about 50 minutes and then give a chance for people to ask questions. I'm really going to concentrate on the spiritual tradition of Islam which is most of all crystallized in Sufism, and say something about its situation in the Islamic world today as well as in the West. But let me just start by saying that when we talk about religion in the contemporary world, uh, which includes, of course, studying of Islam, uh, we must remember that the official uh, university circles, academic circles, which studied religion, they all believed in the early 20th century and the late 19th century in the West that religion was sort of a passing phenomenon, that soon with the spread of modernism, religion would disappear or become very weakened and marginalized. And all of the predictions came out to be wrong. The second half of the 20th century saw a very strong reaction against all the forces which were trying to destroy religion. And these reactions ranged all the way from what's called fundamentalism now, sometimes physically aggressive, some oftentimes intellectually and theologically aggressive, to other forms of revival of Islam, especially traditional Islam, and also of Sufism, about which fewer people speak. Now, it's in light of that background that I want to give you another image from the one that's prevalent in scholarly circles and universities today about Islamic spirituality in the contemporary world. And by Islamic spirituality and Islamic tradition, in its spiritual aspect, I shall mean most of all Sufism, because I do not have time to deal with many other aspects of Islamic spirituality reflected in Islamic art, in literature, in certain forms of Shiite piety, which are also very spiritual, but not Sufi. But the mainstream, you might say, of Islamic spirituality is really Sufism, not only in the Sunni world, but also even in the Shiite world. So let me concentrate on that with this proviso that I made. And I want to say something about Sufism in the world today. First of all, in the West, the acquaintance with Islam, of course, goes back to the Middle Ages. The Quran, by the order of Peter the Venerable, was translated 1,000 years ago by an Englishman into Latin. And many, of course, as you know, works of Islamic thought were translated into Latin and later on into vernacular languages, and even then into Provençal and one or two other languages in the Middle Ages. But nothing, not even a single work of Sufism was translated into European languages. It was carefully observed by the Catholic thinkers who were guiding this whole affair. And it's a very strange phenomenon. What we do have, into Latin, what we do have is a few works trickled down through other languages, the vernacular languages, especially Provençal, some of which even reached Dante, and we see the direct influence of Sana'i and other Persian Sufi writers on the Divine Comedy, which has now been shown clearly by Miguel Atem Palacios, Lucien Lopez Baralt, and others. I will not get into that. That's a different field from what I want to speak about. It was not until the 19th century that in the West, a recognition of the significance of Sufism became prevalent, and it came mostly from the 1830s, or it really starts with the last decade of the 18th century with Jones. Was translated some works in India, but especially in the early 19th century, and especially in the German language, where Hammer Postal and other famous Orientalists of that period, and it spread into the English-speaking world very rapidly, and translations came out of one work after another, and led to, of course, the monumental translation of Nicholson of the Masnavi. And in fact, all of these scholars in England, from Brown to Nicholson to Arbery to Peter Avery, who translated the Mantoqater of Attar before his death, one of the major texts of Sufism, a tradition for a whole century in England, produced remarkable scholars and many lesser known ones, who made a lot of Sufi works available in the English language, and the study of Sufism became prevalent. But that was only the study of ideas or of literary expression of Sufism. The reality of Sufism began to enter into the West from the early 20th century, and I shall come back to that. In the Islamic world itself, before I get to the West, in contrast to what famous writers like even Arbery, who knew very well classical Sufi texts, thought Sufism was not a medieval phenomenon only. I remember the story when my old friend, God bless his soul, Dr. Martin Lings, Abu Bakr Sirajuddin, wrote his remarkable book on Sheikh al-Alawi, the Sufi saint of the 20th century. It was sent actually by the publisher to Arbery to approve as a reader. We all receive books like that. And Arbery called up the publisher, Alan Unwin, which was also my publisher in London, and Mr. Unwin told me about this story before he died. And he said that what the remarkable work is that this man, Alawi, should belong to the 13th century. What is he doing in the 20th century? This idea that serious Sufism belonged to days of old was very prevalent at that time. And therefore, little cognizance has been taken in Western scholarship of really Sufism in the Islamic world in the last 2 centuries. There are some studies, some of my own old friends and colleagues and students, but it's not at all what it should be. Actually, Sufism remained a very major part of the Islamic tradition in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century. It was opposed gradually with the rise of colonialism and modernism in the Islamic world by 2 forces. One was the force of modernism itself, which even spread among some Muslims. We had a lot of Muslim reformers who considered Sufism to be a cause of sort of laziness, lack of energy, disinterest in the world, and therefore the Islamic world falling behind the West, something which is absurd. It's like, I always say, give this example, like number of horses galloping towards the edge of the Grand Canyon about to fall in, and those horses are behind are saying it's too bad we're not catching up with the horses. The other horses are about to fall in. That's how I see the development of modern civilization. But anyway, in the Islamic world, the modernists felt that Sufism was one of the reasons, and we have an opposition to Sufism from the 18th century by almost all the so-called Islamic reformers who were modernists. Even a man like Muhammad Iqbal were deeply influenced by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, but opposed Hafiz and other great Sufi poets. And he was all for this dynamic aspect of Islam, which he thought that Sufism opposed. On the other hand, this the first one, that was the modernist trend. On the other hand, they developed what now we call fundamentalism, which is really taken from the West. Original fundamentalism meant Christian movements who took the Bible literally in the late 1890s and up to 1910 and 1920. They were called fundamentalists, but now it's spread, and I don't need to go over its meaning now, by fundamentalists. And this kind of movement also began in the Islamic world in the Western 18th century. And we have different expressions of it. The one that was most extreme in a certain sense was Wahhabism, which based on its total opposition to Sufism and Shiism, and to what we would call Islamic spirituality. This term was disdained. Even now in Saudi Arabia, you cannot talk about that very easily. Things are changing a bit, but I've lectured God knows how many times in Saudi Arabia in the old days, which I call Arabia, except because I don't know why we have to name it after a family, but anyway, Saudi Arabia. But one of the tenets of this kind of fundamentalism associated with Wahhabism was the opposition to Sufism. And it developed at the same time what is called the Salafi Movement. You're all, I don't know, the great scholars who are with me, but the students should know that the word Salaf, which means ancestor in Arabic, was originally a very positive term. and to follow the aslaf, plural of salaf, was a way to follow the tradition. But gradually gained this meaning that the Salafi meant those who rejected the 14th century development of Islamic civilization, all of the arts and sciences, Sufism, architecture, poetry, all of these, and sort of going back to the Quran, which then they interpreted in a very literary fashion, and against the understand the inner meaning of the Quran from which Islamic spirituality originates, and especially Sufism. Anyway, we had the Salafi movement, which took roots in Syria and Egypt to some extent, where Al-Manar was first published there, which was to a large extent a fundamentalist Salafi publication, and then moved from there to Arabia. But these twin movements of modernism and fundamentalism, although opposed to each other in so many domains, were unified in their opposition to the concrete expressions of Islamic spirituality as found especially in Sufism, or crypto, you might say, Sufi gatherings and organizations, and all the art that went along with it. That's a long, long story about which a lot more should be said. The people in the West who began to study this emphasized this element, but they did not look at the fact that these two movements did not include the whole of Islam. Most of Muslims remained traditionalists, and the Sufi orders continued. A few great Sufi masters who were also political leaders, like Abdul Hadi al-Jazairi, who wrote the great commentaries of Ibn Arabi when he was exiled to Damascus, was of course the leader of resistance against the French in Algeria, and there were other Shamil in the Caucasian region, all over the Islamic world, the Berkeley family in India, in the northwest provinces, fighting against the British. It's a phenomenon you see throughout the Islamic world. This element of Sufism was taken into consideration by some people, but people don't take into consideration the living Sufi traditions, the many great saints who appeared, the many important writings. A man as great as Maulana Ali Thanwi was both a Sufi and a theologian from then India, now Muslim India. How many books do we have about him? How many people at Berkeley, the students even, have read something of him? Nothing. Whereas some secondary, much less important so-called reformer, everybody signs the book of Nikki Keddy or something like that to read about them. So the situation is not what is usually thought to be. In the African world, Black African world, you have remarkable masters from Don Fadio down in places like Algeria, you have later on Senegal. In North Africa and Morocco, you have great sheikhs like Sheikh Ahmed Tijani and later on Sheikh Al-Alawi and others. In Egypt, you have had many, many great Sufi sheikhs from the 19th century onward and so forth and so on. I don't want to go over the whole of the Islamic world. And many of the Sufi orders were renovated even. New great masters appeared in the 19th century, and they influenced a great deal what was going to go on later. Moreover, in the 20th century, the experiments that have been carried out by both the modernists and to some extent fundamentalists, much more by the modernists, because most governments were ruled by the modernists. There were very few fundamentalist governments, but more, except in places like Arabian places like that. These movements had reached a dead end in many ways. And people were looking for new ways of understanding the religion, the tradition of Islam. And many turned to Islamic spirituality. In a country like Egypt has always been a great center of Islamic spirituality and Sufism, with tariqas like the Shadiliya, the Qadiriya, the Rafa'iyya have a long, long history and still do. You have a remarkable revival of interest in Islamic spirituality and Sufism among the educated classes who were educated in the Western way. A large number of doctors, lawyers, engineers, people like that turned to Sufi orders. It's a phenomenon which is really quite interesting. And you see the same thing in many other Islamic countries, including after the founding of Pakistan. You see that also later on in Pakistan. You see it in Muslim India. And I do not have time to go over the whole of the Islamic world, but it's the phenomenon that we must understand. And it's on the basis of that, that along with this reaction in the second part of the 20th century, in the form of revolutionary Islam, the coming of Ayatollah Khomeini, others, you also have the revival and persistence and continuation of Sufism. This must be understood. So much has been written about Ayatollah Khomeini, but Ayatollah Khomeini spent the 4/5 of his life teaching Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadr and people like that. He was initiated into Sufism and was in his 20s. He was seeking for a spiritual master when he was a young talaba in Qom. And you have had other figures who hid this aspect, even political religious figures. Maulana Maududi in his youth translated the Asfar of Mullah Sadra into Urdu, but he hid it. Nobody was able to see it because of what he wanted to present outwardly as a political movement, of Islamic political movement. And there are many, many other examples. So you had a revival of Sufism, which has not been fully studied. Sufism continues today in the Islamic world. Even in Arabia, where it was banned completely, it went underground. And you had great Naqshbandi sheikhs in Mecca. People came from Central Asia to study with them. Even after the Saudis in 1924 established Saudi rule over Mecca and Medina. And you had many, many other masses, even places like that. You have had countries like Libya after Gaddafi came to power, which tried to root out Sufism because the previous regime, the Idrisis, were Sanusis, Sufis, there was Sufi orders ruling over Libya, and they wanted to undo that. So they banned all the Sufi orders, but that's an exception. That's an exception. From Senegal, where over 80% of the population is Muslim, and the vast majority belong to the Qadariyya, the Tijaniya order, and you come all the way across east to the rest of the Islamic world, you see more or less the same phenomenon of the presence of Sufism, despite the opposition of many leaders who were modernists or fundamentalists, despite that. And you see a case, for example, in Pakistan, where the present Prime Minister of Pakistan, whom I know very well, I've known him for 40, 50 years, was very deeply interested in Sufism. And they want to even establish a Sufi university. They've been in touch with me. I've written a report for them about how to do it and so forth and so on. Although I'm very busy and I've grown old, I don't have that much energy. Nevertheless, when asked of me, I always try to help to the extent that I can. It's a phenomenon that is very much present. And anyone who wants to understand Islamic spirituality in its organized, concrete form, of course, any individual can go in a room and become a saint. We're not talking about that. Must understand the presence of Sufism in the Islamic world as a living reality. In Indonesia, in Malaysia, where certain Sufi orders were opposed for political reasons, but other Sufi orders were allowed to function. In Bangladesh, among Muslims of India, in Pakistan was a remarkable revival of the various Sufi orders. In Iran itself, despite the opposition of the last few years to the Sufi orders and what happened in Ghorab and Khorasan, attacking the Sufi center there, despite all of that, look at the number of books of Sufism published in Iran today. Probably more than any other Islamic country, including any Arab country. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how vast it is, how much interest there is, how many young people turn to Sufism. It's a remarkable phenomenon. And come across the map into Turkey itself, where the gradual weakening of Ataturkism and modernism in Turkey, some people became fundamentalists. With the experience of Iran, they moved back. And also Marxism was for a while popular, that also receded somewhat, not completely. But Sufism, on the other hand, has flowered and spread. And so we have, when we think of the Islamic world and we think of religion in the Islamic world, we must think of the spiritual inner dimension of religion foremost, which is my subject of today, and of Sufism, and the fact that Sufism is not only for the 13th century and Jalaluddin Rumi or Fariduddin Attar or Ibn Arabi, it's a living reality in the Islamic world. And I've had a lot of experience, perhaps more than most people, of lecturing in the Islamic world to the young all over the place, from Morocco to Indonesia, always with tremendous amount of interest, and especially in a reinterpretation of the meaning of Sufism to confront contemporary problems. This is really a lecture for another day. Most of the major problems of the Islamic world today, although some are practical, are really deep down philosophical. The great challenge of the West to the Islamic world is not only ladies' dress. Yes, that's important. It's not only changing couscous to biftek in Morocco. Yes, that's important. But most important is a worldview, and a challenge to the most spiritual, intellectual aspects of Islam. And to respond to that challenge, we have to make use of that aspect of Islamic tradition, which is embedded most of all in Sufism. It is not accidental at all. It's not accidental that when in 1962, I gave the 3 lectures at Harvard University, which became 3 Muslim sages, and one of the chapters dedicated to Ibn Arabi, and for the first time spread the teaching of Ibn Arabi in American universities. From that time on, look what's happened to Ibn Arabian studies. How many books and articles are written about Ibn Arabi? There's a whole journal called Ibn Arabi Journal, a tremendous transformation. The same is true of France, to a large extent of Italy and Germany, and other European countries. But let's just stick, or in England itself, let's stick to America where we are right now. So there has been really a very, very important assertion of the reality of Sufism in the Islamic world and as spread to the West, which we must consider as part of the contemporary scene, even with globalization, as there's also the reverse process of trying to emphasize local cultures, which is also very much at hand. Many of them go back to their classical literature. The classical literature, like in Bangladesh, what is classical Bengali literature? Muslim Bengali, not Hindu Bengali. It's so closely allied to Hafiz and Persian Sufi poetry that you can hardly distinguish one from the other. The content, the symbols, the language, except in Bengali. I mean language, I mean poetic language. I don't mean the actual physical language, which is, of course, the Bengali, not Persian. And that's only one example that you must remember. Then you have another phenomenon, which also acts in an action-reaction way with Sufism within the Islamic world, and that is the spread of Sufism into the West. And this is significant for the Islamic world itself, because so much in the Islamic world is now trying to emulate the West. The years when I lived in Iran, if I wrote an article on Sufism or Islamic philosophy in Persian, it would be read in Iran, in Afghanistan, by a few people in Pakistan, and maybe a few scholars in the West. But now, if I write something in English here in Washington, in a few minutes it's on the internet and everybody in the world can read it. What happens for Islam, and especially the spiritual intellectual dimension of Islam in the West, has also great significance for the Islamic world itself. They're not divorced from each other. Now, let's turn to the West. What happened in the West? As I told you, in the West, there was no translation of Sufi texts into Latin in classical times. The heritage of Islam that came to medieval Europe, which had a very important role to play in the whole creation of medieval Europe, from the university system to even dress of students and so on and so on, all of these things did not include directly teachings of Sufism. And I told you the great Ghazali was a major Sufi figure, very well known in Latin as Al-Ghazal, cited tens of times, perhaps over 100 times by St. Thomas Aquinas. What he was known as an Islamic philosopher, as a Hebratic philosopher. His Sufi works, like Mishkat al-Anwar and other Hikmah al-Aduniya and things like that, were not translated into Latin. They were not known. He was not known as a Sufi. And so, as I told you, it was the 19th century that gradually Sufi literature came into the West seriously, influenced the British Romantic movement. People like Tennyson. Tennyson was trying to learn Arabic when it was growing blind in old age. This is a very important phenomenon. But the actual presence of Sufism in the West, authentic presence, goes back to the 20th century. And no one has really written a clear history of this. It's a very interesting phenomenon, especially now that there's all this Islamophobia, opposition to Islam. It's a very good antidote to this malady that is now unfortunately spreading in both Europe, Western Europe, and the United States. Now, as far as we know, it was in the first decade of the 20th century that a man called Abdul Hadi, his Arabic name was Abdul Hadi, was actually a Swede from Sweden of all places, secularized country of Northern Europe. His name was Ageli. He was a Swedish painter. He left Sweden, went to the Islamic world, went to Egypt, embraced Islam, and became a faqir, a Sufi of the Shadiliya order. And his sheikh was a very famous Egyptian sheikh, Sheikh Ilyas al-Kabir, who also was a sheikh of Ganon, of Ghune Ganon, and this Ganon known him well. And Agali, who became Abdul Hadi, learned Arabic very well, began to write in French, and began to introduce Sufism in the traditional circles or circles interested in the East in France. And it was he who introduced Ghune Ganon, Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya later on, the famous traditionalist writer, the founder of the School of Tradition, as we understand it, in France, into Sufism. It took many decades before Ganon, who was given the name Abdul Wahid Yahya by Abdul Hadi, then went to Egypt himself, settled there, and spent the last 20 years of his life there and died there. But through that, the influence of his writings, although we talk about tradition as the whole, universal meaning of tradition through various religions, the first steps were taken really for the presentation of authentic Sufi doctrine, not as borrowing from Neoplatonism and things like that Western Orientalists write about, but as something that derives from the Quran. Now, parallel with that, also, you have to give credit where credit is due. And one or two figures appear, especially one figure within the Western Orientalist circle, which was now teaching Arabic and Persian, the main language of Islam, of Sufism, and other languages in the Sorbonne and other places, to Sufism as an authentic reality. And this was done through the great French scholar Louis Massignon, who wrote a 4-volume work, La Passion d'Al-Hallaj, and he was a member of the French Foreign Service, was a spy really, spying for the French in Egypt and in Syria, and he was a remarkable Arabist, but he had an experience in prison in which Hallaj visited him, and it transformed his life. He became a very devout Catholic, but also a very devout follower of the spirit of Sufism and of Islam. And this 4-volume work, La Passion d'Al-Hallaj, is the first scholarly work accepted by Western universities in which Sufism is presented in a very serious way. And then, but the main contribution of Massignon was that he showed that Sufism issues from the Quran. And this was followed by Margolith, the famous English scholar who also had the same view. And so these people had also a role to play in making Sufism an authentic, or making it to be seen as an authentic spiritual path that emanates from Islam. It's not simply Neoplatonic borrowing or something like that, that the Orientalists were writing about. But as far as Sufism itself is concerned, the spread of authentic Sufi orders, what Abdul Hadi did not catch fire, did not spread very much. It was just a few people in Italy and France who were initiated by him. But the whole event goes back to the great Algerian Sheikh Ahmed bin Aliwa, Sheikh al-Alawi, about whom Martin Links wrote this book, Sufistan of the 20th Century, I told you about. He was a very, very eminent Shadili Sheikh of Algeria. And in 1927, when the French, who already at that time had a lot of Algerians and Moroccans working in France, built the Paris Mosque, which is the most beautiful traditional mosque in Europe. All built by Moroccan and Algerian craftsmen, completely traditional, as if you were in the most beautiful mosque in Morocco, nothing modernistic about it. And it was inaugurated by Sheikh al-Alawi in 1927. It's a very, very important date. So the presence of the major Sufi master, whose teachings were destined to transform, in fact, the whole scenery in the West as far as Sufism was concerned, because he was followed by Friedrich Schuon, Sheikh Isa, Nuruddin, who also was a European with a German origin, who became a Muslim and became a Murid, disciple of Sheikh al-Alawi, and who came back to Europe to plant the tree of Sufi orders in his authentic way for the first time, perhaps since the Middle Ages in Spain, of course, being an exception, or in southern France, in the main European soil. And from the 1920s, 1930s, when Sheikh Isa Friedrich Schuon came back to Europe, gradually his own Sufi order, which is a branch of the Shadili order, grew, and then other orders also grew and continued to grow to this day. Now, I also need to mention that parallel with this, there was another Sufi movement associated with a man called Ayat Khan. Ayat Khan was an Indian Sufi. He belonged to the Chishti order. And he was ordered, apparently, according to his disciples, by his master to go to the West and teach Sufism. And so he started from the other side to the Pacific. He landed in San Francisco and initiated two or three people into Sufism, into Islam, then came to New York, and from there went to Europe and settled in Holland. And unfortunately, his circle gradually became a kind of Sunday afternoon tea party for ladies interested in Sufism. I don't want to be too critical, but I'm exaggerating somewhat. That is, he divorced Sufism from the Sharia, from Islamic law, tried to present Sufism as something separate from Islam, really, although he himself was a Muslim, of course, from a noble Muslim family. It was the same that was followed by Idris Shah, the famous Afghani figure who a few decades ago was very popular in England and in America. His writings were read all the time, and he was tried to do the same. These are Muslim figures who tried to present Sufism in a sense independent of Islam that they thought people would not like. So let's present Sufism as if it's something in a vacuum. And of course, I'm very much opposed to that. In 1964, when Idris Shah's famous book on Sufism came out, I wrote a critical review of it. And he was not very happy about it, but I felt it was my duty, which some who are interested can read. And Idris Shah doesn't have much following anymore, but he did establish a group in England. So he also had parallel with what came out of the Shadiliya Tariqa, Shadiliya Al-Qawiya Alawiya Tariqa of Sheikh al-Alawi and Sheikh Isa in continental Europe. You also had the Chishti order coming from India the other way. But the great impact that came for the changing of the whole cosmic ambience, you might say, of the West, for the preservation, for the presentation and growth of Sufism comes really from the Alawiya order. At least that's my view. Anyway, after that, gradually, well, for the Second World War came, there was a kind of stop, but after that, a number of other orders were established. Even the Second World War caused some strange things. For example, there were some Yemenis who were had a shipwreck because of the German mine, and they settled in England, and they were all members of a Sufi order and established a Zawiya there in the middle of England. There are phenomena like that also in France, but those are exceptions. It was really after the Second World War that Sufi orders began to spread more and more into the West, first in France and England, and then in America and Germany and Italy and other places. And that process is still continues. So if you look at the scenery now, my time is almost up. I have to stop to give you a chance to ask questions. If you look at the scenery from the point of Islamic spirituality and its crystallized Sufi form, I'm not saying general Islamic spirituality. I'm loving the Prophet. Of course, most Muslims love the Prophet. That's a part of Islamic spirituality. Talking about the concrete phenomenon of Sufism, you might say that you have three forms of presence of Sufism as Islamic spirituality in the West today. One is authentic Sufism. Real Sufi orders, they're orthodox, authentic, with their lineage, with their silsila, and they include the Naqshbandi order, Sheikh Nazim, for example, who was from Cyprus, who died recently. He spread the Naqshbandi order into both England and America. You have the Qadiriya order, you have the Rafa'iyya order, you have the Shadiliya order, Chishti order in Canada, and so forth. I'm not going to go into that, but the students especially should be aware that there are a large number of Sufi orders throughout the United States and in Western Europe. I just sit here right now, even in Sweden, in which only 3% of people go to church. Sweden is Lutheran, only 3% of people go to church. It's supposed to be the most secularized country in Europe, but even there are some serious Sufi orders. Then we have a second phenomenon, which I could call diluted Sufism. That the people who are interested in Sufism understand and its beauty, its spirituality, its teaching, but they're not willing to become Muslims and to say the daily prayers and to accept the discipline that is necessary in order to become a serious Sufi, which entails tremendous spiritual discipline, of course, of invocation and meditation, of so forth and so on, into which I have not gone because it was not the subject of my discourse today, what I call diluted Sufism. And sometimes I say jokingly, I say California Sufism, because it's especially prevalent in California and San Francisco every Saturday evening. The meetings of people called Sufis, about 500 people. They get together, they all have rosaries, and they invoke the divine name and chant Sufi poetry or music, but they're not even Muslims. So there is a phenomenon that you see, especially in the western part of the United States, but also sometimes in New York and Washington and other places, and you also have it in Europe. So it's the second form of presence of Sufism. Then you have what I call adaptations of Sufism. That is, there are certain groups among Christians and also among Jews in the West, and especially in America, and also in England. These two countries I know better as far as this is concerned. Also some people in France I know, who are trying to adopt certain teachings of Sufism for themselves as Christians or Jews, following their own religion, but realizing that what they can gain access to, at least in their own religion, has forgotten some of these teachings. If, let's say, you're a Jew in Washington and become interested in the Kabbalah, what are the Kabbalistic teachers in Washington to go to? There are some. There are some in New York, in Brooklyn, and so on, but they're rare. They're very hard to find. In Christianity, it's even more difficult. Where are the Meister Eckharts and Angelus Silesiuses that you love so much as a Christian? Where do you find one to give you instructions? So many people who are devout Catholics, very serious Catholics, are trying, and also Jews are trying now to adopt certain teachings. And this is a very complicated matter, certain Sufi teachings. For example, I know some Kabbalistic and Hasidic rabbis who have Sufi teachers in Jerusalem. And the religion has allowed them to not only learn words from them, but also spiritual experience. I know that personally. And I know also some Catholics and even some Protestants, at least the more traditional forms of Protestantism, like the Anglicans, who, and this phenomenon exists. This must not be confused with those movements in the West which try to take certain elements from Sufism and make them into New Age or really new amalgamations of religion. The prime example is Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff still has a lot of followers in France and also some in the United States among intelligent people. Gurdjieff was a person from the East. He said he had learned the secrets of Sufism from the hidden men of Central Asia and all kinds of pseudo mythology that goes with it. But he had some knowledge of Sufism, but he combined it actually with Western occultism. So all of these different phenomena must be understood if we're going to have an understanding of the influence of Sufism, the presence of Sufism in the West today. Now, I have to stop. The time allotted to me is over. But I'm going to summarize by saying that when we talk about Islamic spirituality, of course, the word spirituality is very nebulous. It's now become a favorite in the West to replace religion almost. You don't talk about religion, you talk about spirituality. But Sufism is Islamic spirituality with a form that is given by heaven. That is a Quranic form, that the barakah of the Prophet of Islam. It's not just nebulous, as they've converted Rumi into a kind of universal poet of love as if you're not even a Muslim, like some of the translations of Rumi that appear in English today. You have that reality, but you also have those other interpretations of it, which are not total, sometimes they're misguided, sometimes they're partial. But despite the rise of Islamophobia, opposition to Islam in general, Sufism continues to flourish in the West. There are many, many people who come to Sufism all the time, even now in the middle of all this crisis that surrounds us in every way. And so the understanding of Sufism as the heart of Islamic spirituality today is a very important matter to understand the situation of spirituality in the world. We're going to talk about religion in the world. Sufism and elements like it from other religions play a central role in the understanding and spread of religion in the world, which on outside of Europe and America is becoming more and more religious. Europe is the only secularized continent in a total way in which 30% of Frenchmen are agnostics and atheists. You don't have that phenomenon in Hindu India. You do not have it in the Islamic world. You do not have it in Buddhist countries. And even in China, which is communist, there's a return to Neo-Confucianism and Confucianism in a remarkable way. I don't know what the new government now will do with the killing of all the Uyghurs and imprisoning them. That may change, I don't know. But until now, there's been a return under the cloak of communism in China back to the Confucian tradition in many ways. So it's a global reality. And within that, the role of Islam as the last religion, and within that last religion, the role of Sufism as a spiritual heart of Islam is very important for understanding the situation of religion in the world today, and also for trying to look into the future. I said nothing at all about the future because I'm not one of the futurologists. The future is in the hands of God, and one act of God could change everything, all our formulations. all the people have been futurologists, if you study them now, all this stuff of the future, 90% of it came to be untrue. So I don't want to say about the future, except to say that whatever happens, as long as we're around, as long as the Islamic tradition and the Ummah, the Islamic peoples are around, the Islamic spiritual dimension is going to survive. The Sufism is not going to die as either the modernists or the fundamentalists think it will. That's all I have to say. I shall stop here, alhamdulillah. And if there are any questions, I have also one of my assistants who's here. In case I don't hear the question well, they will translate them or reiterate it for me. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr, for enlightening. I myself have questions, and I think there is a backdrop noise. Perhaps Dr. Nasr, your assistant could turn off your sound back to me, and I don't know if it's coming to others as well. Could you temporarily, are you able to disable your, oh, now it's better, there. I think we fixed it. Okay, thank you very much. That was an enlightening talk. There are many questions in the chat window, but I, if you don't mind, would like to take the privilege as the moderator to ask the first one. I want us to go back to reflect on the question of the relation of Sufism to nationalism. I find that in the 20th century, there were certain strange phenomena with Sufism that took place in relation to the formation of nation states. I don't think, for example, you mentioned Iqbal, who is one of my favorite poets, much of whose poetry I've committed to memory. And the way Iqbal was deployed for nationalist purposes with an undertone of Sufism has always confused me. So, you know, we have poems, for example, from Hazrat-e-Insan, for example, where he says, Jahan mein danish o binish ki hai kis darja arzani. You know, how, you know, in this world, knowing and seeing is so utterly easy. Koi shayad chup nahi sakti ke ye alam hai nurani. Nothing can be hidden because the world is light. So he's using Sufi symbolism here. And he continues by saying, Koi dekhe to hai barik fitrat ka hijab itna. If somebody wishes to see the hijab, the veil of nature is so utterly, you know, barik, so subtle, so you can see right through it. And he says, Numaya hai farishton ke tabassum hai pinhai. So, you know, it's so easy to see the faint smiles of the angels behind this structure of reality. So he is, of course, a consummate Sufi, you know, influenced by Rumi and others. But it's interesting to me to think about how his work then is used for nationalist purposes, and he's become the father figure of Pakistan. I'm reminded of his Tarana-e-Milli, for example, and please excuse me for giving these shawahid so that we can talk in detail about it. So, you know, his Tarana-e-Milli, you know, which is on the same meter as the Indian national song, as you know, right? There he says, Chino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Muslim hai hum, Watan hai Sara Hamara, Sara Jahan Hamara. You know, China and the Arab world are ours, meaning in the sense we belong everywhere. We are Muslims. The whole world is our watan. He uses the word watan, nation. So it's not a specific geographical location. In that same poem, he says, "Arze pak teri hurmat pe kat amare hum, hai khoon teri ragon mein ab tak rawan hamara." So, oh pure beloved earth, in defending you, we were cut apart. We were slaughtered. And you might remember, O earth, that our blood runs through all your veins. So this is the kind of Sufism, the kind of trans-regional approach to belonging that through the Sufi vision that Iqbal has. But then we get the Indian anthem, the national anthem on the same meter, which you'll recognize, you know, where we have, he says, Mazhab nahi sikhata apas mein bair rakhna. You know, religion doesn't teach us to have differences among ourselves. Now he says, Hindi hai hum, watan hai Hindustan Hamara. We are Indians, and our nation, Watan, is now being transformed from the last form. Our nation is India. And then again, the final one I'll tell you says, Ghurbat hai mein ho agar hum rehta hai dil watan mein. Even if we are in Ghurba, and this is again a Sufi notion, even in Ghurba, our heart stays in our Watan, in our nation. And then he goes on to talk about our heart belongs to wherever our Watan is. So I'm really confused about how in the modern age, in the contemporary age, the idea of a nation state seems to have emerged out of these Sufi inclinations whose primary interest seems to be transregional, beyond borders. And so perhaps you could reflect on that a little bit, the deployment of Sufism and Sufi thought in the service of nation-state politics. Perhaps you could tell us a little about that.
All right. This is a very complicated matter, of course. Nationalism came from the West. And the Sufis were the last people to have any nationalistic feelings. There's a famous Persian poem. The word for nation is watan in Arabic, which we also have in Persian and Urdu, your mother tongue. It says, in watan misr Iraq و شام نیست. این وطن آنجاست کان را نام نیست. This watan is not Egypt. It's not Iraq. It's not Syria. This watan is where there's a land that has no name. Watan was always a spiritual reality in traditional Islam, combined with where it came from locally. I always tell my students when I was in Tehran, when our servant wanted to go to the village for a 3-day holiday from which he came, 50 miles from Tehran, he would say, Aga, I want to go to my watan, the Ramiran Watan. It was not the nationalist Iran with the flag and the national anthem and so forth and so on. Now, when modern nationalism came to the Islamic world, many Sufis supported it as a way of preserving their culture. For example, Abdul Qadir Jazairi, he's considered to be the national figure that unites Algeria. When Algeria became independent, they took out his body out of the grave in Damascus and carried it to Algiers and buried in the middle of a very big square with monument and so on and so on. It symbolizes the nationhood of Algeria. But he never spoke about nationalism. He spoke about Islam. When did he ever talk about Algeria? We're different from Morocco. We have a right to that territory that the Moroccans claim, and this. There was never anything like that. There was never anything like that. In the case of the 20th century, you have certain figures who made use of the power of this idea of watan to politicize it in the Western sense. Now, the case of Iqbal is very interesting from that point of view. He was an Indian Muslim, originally from Kashmir. India had never experienced nationalism in the Western sense. India was a whole continent, was the whole world. Kashmir was distinct from Madhya Pradesh or some other place in Madhya Pradesh, other province from Bihar, north from south, and so on and so on. It was a culture that held that India together. And the Muslims who lived in India, like the parents of Iqbal and Iqbal himself, of course knew they were not Tunisians. They knew they were Indians. There's no doubt about that. But the idea of creating a Muslim homeland, which would be defined not by ethnicity, not by history, but by religion, is what Iqbal did. And if he had talked about a homeland for the sake of Islam, which he did, that would be fine. But to combine that with the idea of modern nationhood brought about certain paradoxes from which Pakistan still suffers. So the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Then you tell your prime ministers or prime minister of the Islamic Republic have stolen money and put them in prison. I mean, you understand what I'm talking about. It would have been much better if if Iqbal had not been considered the father of the Pakistani nation as he is, but of the culture of Islam and the religion of Islam for the Muslims of subcontinent of India or something like that, which then crystallized through Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Ayat Khan and others into what we have as East and West Pakistan now. West Pakistan is Pakistan itself, is Pakistan and Bangladesh. And this unfortunately has happened in the 20th century, but the case of Iqbal is extreme because the other nationalist leaders that came up that, like for example, Kemal Ataturk, he was not a major Islamic thinker. Before the establishment of Turkey and the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, he was Mustafa Kemal Pasha. He was Ghazi, with the Qayn and Z, not Ghadi, Ghazi. I considered to be a kind of heroic warrior at the frontiers of Islam. He was a mujahid in that sense. And he took advantage of that after the Battle of Gallipoli and so forth to preserve the unity of Turkey and became Kemal Ataturk, a nationalist, but nothing to do with Islam. It destroyed so much of Islam in Turkey. I couldn't do it all, but it did a great deal. And so you had this phenomenon, which must not be confused, in fact, with Sufism, that occasionally people made use of Sufi ideas, like the case of Iqbal, to promulgate a political idea which turned into nationalism. And there's still, as I said, an ambiguity in Pakistani nationalism. I know Pakistan, but it's a second home to me. I've been to Pakistan 20 times. I've met all of your presidents and prime ministers down the road from the time I was young until I said the present prime minister was a good friend of mine. It's a second home to me. I know it very well. After 70 years, it's difficult. Iran, my own country, during the Qajar period, was called Mamalik Mahruse, countries. It was a remnant of a Persian empire. It was plural. It was not even called one country. And Reza Shah comes and creates nationalism. Iran is this line you draw with like a cat sitting down. What about across the line? Is Herat any different from Mashhad? No. It's now another country called Afghanistan. So this phenomenon of nationalism became a strong phenomenon as a reaction to colonialism. Obviously, before the colonial period, if you were an Egyptian, you could pack your bag and walk to Tehran. There were no passports, no visas. Somebody would stamp you're leaving one country. All this came with colonialism, and with it came this modernistic aspect. And some people made use of Sufism as a strong set of ideas to try to promulgate that at Iqbal. In other cases, Sufis were used for that purpose, as we have in the foundation of both Libya and the new set up in Algeria. The Libya has really two parts, left and west and east, and they're very different. Benghazi and Tripoli are very different in many ways, even the food that you eat. One is like Egypt, one is like Morocco. But they're bound together by Sufi order. And so the Sufi order played an important role. But Malik Idris was not at all a nationalist like that. Like Jamal Abdel Nasr, he's not an Arab nationalist leader. And when we study these things, we have to be very, very careful about the different nuances that we have to use in concerning such leaders. Does anyone else have any question? I'm sorry this question took so long to answer. It's a very important question.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr, for elaborating. I look forward to another lunch and talk more. I think the issue is ultimately one of ambiguity. The expression watan, going back, Hanin al-Awtan, which occurs in Arabic poetry, which doesn't mean nation. And even in the Indian national anthem, one of the lines is "Samjho wahi hame bhi dil ho jahan hamara," which is ambiguous. Think that we are wherever our heart is. And he's playing with the word jahan as well, which in Urdu means wherever, the place, but it's also jahan as the world. I think there has been a transformation of Iqbal in the national interest. There is a rewriting of his position. The Persian expression you gave us, of course, is reflected in Iqbal's statement, which is rather well known, millat az watan nist. So he says that. But anyway, we will talk in more detail. I do not want to take this opportunity all for myself. I see, and I think there are 100 questions here. I'll just go down the line. The first one is, my question for Dr. Nasr is as follows. Are the concepts of Islamic spirituality and Sufism one and the same, or are they different? And if they are different, how so?
The term spirituality is a modern term in English. Spiritus in Latin, of course, the medieval term used a great deal. But spirituality was used for the first time in European language in the 18th century. Very, very recent. So when we talk about spirituality, it's speaking in English now. If we were using Arabic or Persian, what term would we use? The two Islamic languages, I know a little bit. I don't know, except for a few words of Urdu and Ottoman Turkish, so I will not get into these two languages. You would use the word ruhaniya in Arabic. Ruhiya, ruhaniya. And in Persian, you use that, ruhaniyat, but also the word ma'naviyat, which you also have in Urdu as spirituality. That would have a meaning, inner meaning, ma'naviyat. Now, you cannot say that all Islamic ruhaniya or ma'naviyat Islami in Persian is contained in Sufism. I did not claim that. But Sufism is the heart of Islamic spirituality, and the structures have been created to preserve and continue in continuity without distortion and with continuous renewal through each person and through each generation, Islamic spirituality. So you can have a Muslim who's spiritual, who's not a Sufi, of course. But the greatest expositions of Islamic spirituality are found in Sufism. And one of the proofs of that is that in almost every Islamic language, including your language, Urdu, Islamic spiritual message is heard by common people, most of all through poetry, and it's Sufi poetry. I've known Tonga drivers in Pakistan who knew Hafiz and Rumi by heart. Totally illiterate Tonga drivers. In my young days when I used to go to Pakistan all the time. I know the country, as I said, quite well, like a palm of my hand. And also in India, other places. I've met beggars in Morocco who knew a few poems, or in Egypt, of Ibn al-Farid, of local Sufi poets. So poetry was the way in which Islamic spirituality reached many people, even beyond the boundary of Sufism itself. If there is a room of 1,000 people, and 100 people are Sufis, let's say in my own country, Iran, who read the Masnavi with a full awareness of the inner meaning, the other 900 people also read the Masnavi. There's no Persian who doesn't know some poems of Jalaluddin Rumi. The first cousin of my mother was the head of the Iranian Communist Party, Tudeh Party, Dr. Kianuri, a very famous man in Iran who died after the revolution and made peace with Ayatollah Khomeini, and they got him out of prison and he died. He used to come to our house when I was a young boy and tell my father was a very famous and great scholar that soon we're going to take over Iran, the Tudeh Party, and he would quote a poem from Sufi poetry. That's how widespread Sufi poetry is in the Persian-speaking world, and to a large extent among other Muslims. I know that in your country, and also among Muslims of India, I've been to many mushairas in Delhi and other places, and not only in Pakistan. The presence of Sufi poetry as a way of emanating Islamic spiritual symbols, ideas, allusions to pure or not technically in the Sufi tariqas is very great.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr. I think the next question is a good segue, I think. The person asks, can you can and how can Sufism, and can it play a bridging role across sectarian divides?
That's a very important question. The only reality that can create this bridge, besides the question of convenience and diplomacy, which oftentimes exists between religions, but in reality, create the bridge is Sufism. First of all, Shiism is also heir to Walaya, to the inner dimension of prophecy, which consists of both Nubuwwah and Walaya. Nubuwwah is the legislating aspect of prophetic function. Walaya is the initiatic guidance and spiritual guidance. Of course, the word Walaya has many other meanings, but in this meaning that I'm using now, Sufism issues from Muhammadan Barakah and Walaya. So it goes given to him by God. With his death, the death of alayhi salatu wasalam, Nubuwwah comes to an end. His Khatam al-Anbiya. But the function of Walaya continues and will continue to the end of time. You had great debates in the history of Islam. Who is the Khatam al-Awliya? Is the Prophet the Khatam al-Anbiya? And I'm not going to get into that very, very thorny and complicated question, but the listeners should know that such a question exists. So this is Sufism. Sufism is the heir to Walaya. Without Walaya, there would be no Sufism. But Walaya also plays a very important role in Shiism. The first 8 Shiite Imams, up to Imam Rida, was buried in Mashhad, in Khurasan, in northeast present-day Iran, Persia. They're all poles of the chains of Sufi tariqas in the Sunni world, except for the Naqshbandi order, which goes back to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, the 6th Shiite Imam, and very important figure in Sunni Islam, of course, and Hadith and many other things. They all go back to Ali. They all go back to Ali. And many Sufis have written the profoundest works on the spiritual question of the Walaya in Ali, and it was transmitted step by step. After the 8th Shiite Imam, all of whom are poles of various Sufi orders in the Sunni world, then, in a sense, 12 Imam Shiism and Sufism part ways somewhat, but not completely, because there continue to be Shiite Sufi orders. Today in Iran, you have a very large number of people who are members of Sufi orders. The Wahhabi order, the Nematullahi order, the Khaksar order. They're the 3 most widespread Sufi orders among Shiite Persians. 10% of Persians are Sunnis in Kurdistan and Lorestan, and there the Naqshbandiya and the Qadiriya order are very popular. So you have Shiite Sufism, and then you have, of course, the Sufi orders in the Sunni world. And it's not a question of race and ethnicity. I don't at all accept what some of my countrymen, the modernized Persians or nationalists, say, oh, this is all genius of Persians invented Sufism. Is total. I don't accept that at all. Total nonsense from my point of view. Although I'm a Persian myself, or the right of it in Persian, I do not accept that thesis at all. Don't do with ethnicity. The founder of the most widespread Sufi order in Iran today, the Nematullahi order, which are now spread into both England and America, has Khanaqahs, Sufi centers right here in Washington, New York, San Francisco, other places, all over the place, and also London, at Oxford, and many other places are now spreading into West Africa, interestingly enough, the Nematullah order. The founder was a man called Shah Nematullah Wali, and he was not a Persian. He was a Syrian from Aleppo. He was an Arab, had nothing to do with ethnicity whatsoever. He was not even a Persian. And there are no Arab Nematullahis, except now a few in Washington maybe, but if you go to Iraq or Syria or Egypt, there's no Nematullahi order. So you have this reality of Sufism being heir to the dimension of walaya, which I don't want even to translate. Can be pronounced both as walaya and wilaya, different meanings, but both meanings are there really together in this initiatic spiritual function. But Shiism is also heir to that. Although Shiism also has an exoteric aspect, it's an exoterism, whereas Sufism in the Sunni world leaves the exoteric aspect completely to the ulama of the Sharia. There are ulama in the Sunni world who are also, of course, great Sufis. Shah Ahmed Keftaru, the Grand Mufti of Syria, was a friend of mine who died recently. He was a Kurdish alim. He was a Grand Mufti of Syria, a Sunni country, but he was a Sufi. That can occur, but the two are kept more separate. And this is a very complicated matter. Whoever asked this question, some years back, I wrote an essay called Sufism and Shiism, which I tried to hash out this very, very difficult and complicated relationship. They may refer to that. All right, my time is up, but I will accept one last question.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Nasr. The next question is, please ask Dr. Nasr what role of Sufism he sees in contemporary Shia Iraq, especially among the followers of Ayatollah Ali Sistani. Do you think they also have a type of Sufism, whether it's authentic or diluted and so on? Do they also have a type of Sufism in practice or in spirit? And do they recognize it as Sufism?
This is a very complicated question. There's also some politics associated with this. I've never met Ayatollah Sistani. Ayatollah Khoy, who before him was Marja Taqlid, the leader of Shiism, I met personally in Iraq before the Iran Revolution. I went to see him. But Ayatollah Sistani I've not met. But I know some of his teachers, and he had the classical, of course, Shiite instruction as an alim, which included also studying some philosophical texts of the Sufi character, which included, of course, the writings of Sadruddin Shirazi, Mullah Sadra, the great sage of the Safavid period, whose book, the Asfar, is read as the most advanced book of Hikmah in Shiism, which consists really of both philosophy and Sufism, you might say, but discursive philosophy and intuitive Sufism and illumination, Ashraq. I don't have time to get into all of that now. But Ayatollah Sistani, a few months ago, did something very strange, was really surprised. I was going to write a letter to him, banning the teaching of the Asfar in Najaf, whereas it's taught very widely in Qom, in Tehran, even in Mashhad, which is anti-philosophical in the Shiite Iran. It's taught all over the place. And my own teacher, Allama Tabatabai, was one of the great ulama of Shiism, was also a great master in teaching of the Asfar. And this man, Mr. Hadi Qazvini, you should know, was once a student for many years of Ayatollah Rafi Qazvini, the great sage, really, master of the school of Mullah Sadra, who secretly also wrote some commentaries on the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi. So you had this reality in Iran in my own days. All my teachers were very well versed in Sufism as well. I never studied Ayatollah Khomeini, but he also, before getting to politics, belonged to this kind of group. So in Najaf, in the old days, there was less emphasis upon Sufism. But there were remarkable Sufi teachers there, including a man called Wahid al-Ain, apparently had only one eye, and Qadi, both of whom were teachers of Allama Tabatabai, Sufi teachers, spiritual teachers. who put him into a spiritual retreat, into khalwa, into practice of dhikr, of meditation, which Allama Tabatabai still followed very secretly, but I was very close to him. I knew what he was doing, what spiritual practices were. So there was a presence of Sufism also in Najaf. When Ayatollah Sistani became the supreme head of Shiism, in a sense, this element was left untouched. But for some reason, which I think probably is political, maybe under the pressure of local Shiite fundamentalists or other political reason, I do not know, he gave this direction a few months ago, which has not been followed in Iran, even by those who consider him as marja taqlid, as a source of emulation in Shiism. So it's a confused situation, and I'm not in a position to say what is really in his heart, why he did that. But for the moment, the teaching of Sufism and of later Islamic philosophy, not early Islamic philosophy, later Islamic philosophy, which is highly mystical in content, is banned in the madrasa of Najaf. But that there are Sufis still in Najaf, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. I'm sure some of the disciples are. But unfortunately, this has taken place, and the reason for it, I do not know. Anyway, I shall not take any more of your time. I'm also tired out. I'm an old person now. I first of all thank God that He has made this occasion possible for us. I want to thank all of you, and I pray for all of you and all those who are listening. And inshallah, Allah Ta'ala will guide us all. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you all for being here. We'll have a recording of this available at Bayan's YouTube channel, as well as on our website called bayanonline.org. I encourage all of you to continue the conversation about Dr. Nasr's thoughts and ideas that he presented, which were very fascinating and illuminating, as well as our other programs and webinars that we've done in partnership with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. We thank you. Thank you, Dr. Asad Ahmed, for moderating. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.